Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the Football Engineer Podcast. I'm your host Jose, and today we're going to talk about Matchday 12. But first, I'd like to talk a bit about some of the format changes I'm going to be doing for the podcast. The first one, if you've already noticed, is that I'm not doing intros. I love the intros and I hope you like them too, but it takes a bit of a while to make them really good, so I'm going to cut down on them from now. But going into the more fundamental changes, I like to do these changes to help try to make the podcast a bit more concise. Again, I'm still trying to cut it down from 30 minutes to 20 minutes. Number two, I think that right now the podcast and the content on the Twitter match reviews is too similar, so I want to do something slightly different with the podcast. And three, I started doing this more rigid podcast structure of match reviews as a way to build my confidence as a speaker. It's basically like a football player trying to build up his technique. And I think right now that my speaking technique has improved from when I just started the podcast. I think, or I'd like to think, that I'm a bit more fluid and confident with when I speak. So now that I've done that, I'd like to turn and make this podcast format into something that's less of a rigid lecture and more of a conversation with you and with the future guests I'm going to have on the show. And to do that, I'm going to structure the podcast differently now. So instead of doing a full thorough match review of each match, what I'm going to do is that we're going to take what we learned from the match day to answer one question about each team that played. And see where that goes from there. Again, the important thing is that you will be able to answer these questions on your own and give me your own opinions on them. And eventually, yes, I'm going to take your questions and answer them in the podcast because, again, this is a conversation, a discussion. This is what football should be, not a lecture. And without further ado, it's time to answer the first question. We're going to talk about Egypt in the light of their defeat against Saudi Arabia. And my question is, should Egypt go back to their traditional football identity? You see, I think it's very meaningful that Egypt was defeated by a team like Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has many defects, but if there's something that I like, is that they stayed true to their football identity. They understand that their strong point is having good technical players, players who are very good on the ball. So Saudi Arabia understands that they have to create advantages with their game on the ball, with their possession game. They did not compromise on that. And yes, that probably makes them a weaker team in defense, but it focuses on their strengths. And my question with Egypt is, are they doing that? Are they really focusing on their strengths? Because the case of Saudi Arabia is not the only one in the Arab world. You see Morocco, you see Tunisia. They are also teams whose main style of play is the possession game, is their on-the-ball organization, which takes advantage of the fact that they have good technical players on the ball with good touch. So, and Egypt does too. That's the problem. Egypt has other talented attacking players other than Salah. And I get that feeling that Hector Cooper's Egypt doesn't take advantage of that. As we know, Cooper's Egypt is a more defensive team that prefers to do a bit of a low block, a bit of a medium block for pressing, and then go on the counter, taking advantage of the individual skill of their players, especially Salah. But they don't really have a possession game. Cooper is not interested in that. So sometimes it sometimes even looks like Egypt doesn't really know what to do with the ball. And again, that for a team in the Arab world, I find it really profoundly weird and contradictory because I am pretty sure that Egypt has players who know what to do on the ball. And I think whoever manages Egypt should be able to make the players do that, to do what they like doing, which is associating with each other, making passing combinations, creating a good attacking game. Again, that's what Egypt themselves have been traditionally good at. So I am not against teams trying to get input from coaches from other regions and learn from them. But whenever you learn from them, you should do it in such a way that it adapts to your own football identity. And what it feels right now is that Egypt took the advice of a coach who is well versed in European football, but they used an identity that doesn't really go with their traditional identity and that doesn't fit their traditional player profile. And I think that if they do that, perhaps in the future, we could see Egypt get better results. I can guarantee that will happen, but it's clear that the defensive football identity that was being used here didn't work. And now, talking about a team that has a very well-defined traditional identity and will not change it whatever happens, time to talk about Uruguay. In this segment, I'd like to talk about Uruguay in the context of the match that saw Uruguay defeat Russia by 3-0. And I'd like to ask the question, what will Uruguay's midfield look like in the knockout stages, in particular in this match against Portugal? And I think the game against Russia gave us some hints of how Uruguay might play. Now, to give a bit of an introduction, Uruguay has had a bit of an identity crisis in the last few years. They are usually a more direct team. Long ball to the strikers, don't care too much about midfield play, but their old guard of midfielders is, well, getting older, has declined, is retiring, and over the last few years, Uruguay has had this new, young, exciting generation of midfielders, but that is a bit more focused on passing, so that is adding some nuances to the traditional direct Uruguayan identity. Now, these are midfielders like Lucas Torreira from Sampdoria, who's reportedly an Arsenal target right now. We have Rodrigo Betancourt from Juventus, Matias Vecino from Inter. We have De Arrascaeta from Cruzeiro, Nandes, who I don't remember what team he plays for, and Diego Laxalt from Genoa. And we saw all of them play in the Russia game. Now, for the case of Portugal, I am fairly certain that we're going to see Betancourt and Vecino in the starting lineup, mostly because they've been playing through all of Uruguay's group stage games. They've been starting with Uruguay for a while, so they've been part of the starting lineup many times already. I would expect them to be there. Now, the ones I have more doubts about, but that I would really like to see in the starting lineup are first, Lucas Torreira. He's probably my favorite one of the young Uruguayan midfielders because I think he has the strongest personality. He's the one who is more likely to imprint his own playing style in whatever team he is. In other words, if you put him in Uruguay's midfield, you automatically transform Uruguay into a more proactive, possession-based team. He's the kind of guy who likes to rack up passes. I very much like that a Spanish journalist sort of made the comparison of calling him the Uruguayan Verratti, basically as a guy who has good touch, who likes to rack up passes, but who also likes to tackle, and that's very coherent with the Uruguayan football identity, by the way. Now, the other Uruguayan midfielder that I very much liked is one who didn't play as a midfielder, Diego Laxalt. So, Laxalt usually plays as a left midfielder or left attacking midfielder for Genoa, but in the case of Uruguay, he's playing as a left back. And I very much like that, because Uruguay has usually suffered from the problem of having too conservative, too linear fullbacks. For example, they normally use Martín Cáceres as a fullback. Martín Cáceres is a center back, and he's never going to make like a deep run on his wing. Or sometimes if they have deeper fullbacks, they are more linear. They do the runs up and down the pitch, but they're not really creative. Laxalt is a complete upgrade on all of this. This is a guy who has the speed and stamina and energy to make runs up and down the pitch, but he also has the creativity. He has good touch. He can combine well with his midfield teammates, and I think he's been doing a great job over the last few matches, making Uruguay's attack wider, deeper, and more creative. And honestly, players like Torreira and Laxalt will be very useful in the case of Portugal. We already know that Portugal, similar to Uruguay, is a reactive team that prefers to counterattack, that prefers to sit back and defend. So that means that Uruguay is going to need some creativity, some good possession game, and they will have phases in which they will need to be proactive in order to break down the Portugal defense. And I think that having Laxalt and Torreira in the lineup can be very useful for that. In the case of Laxalt, maybe the doubts that Tavares could have is that he prefers a more defensive fullback. That could be an issue. And in the case of Torreira, perhaps he might want to change, it might force him to change the lineup from the traditional 4-4-2. Although I think there are ways to accommodate him. For example, you could have Betancourt play as a wide midfielder and have a double pivot with Vecino and Torreira. That's one way to do it. And another way to do it could be similar to what we saw against Russia, which I found very interesting because Tavares usually doesn't stray away from his 4-4-2, but against Russia he did. He used a midfield diamond with Lucas Torreira as the holding midfielder, and then as central midfielders we had Vecino and Nandes, and then Rodrigo Betancourt as sort of the attacking midfielder in the midfield diamond. So we might be surprised by Uruguay's lineup against Portugal, but something tells me that he's not going to switch from the 4-4-2 that Tavares normally uses. But we'll see what happens. And well, since we've been talking about Portugal in the context of this Uruguay game, now it's time to deal with Portugal and their attacking issues. Now I'd like to talk about the cases of Portugal and Iran, who played a very interesting match that ended up tied 1-1 that often felt more VAR used than actual football, but it was still entertaining in its own American football way. But anyways, going into Portugal, I guess the main thing I had in mind is just what is wrong with Portugal's attack in general. It's a bit of a disappointment in these group stages, that the attack seemed like it lacked structure and that it was too dependent on Ronaldo for structure. The only times that Portugal's counterattack looked really solid was when Ronaldo dropped down to act as the playmaker, as the guy who organized the counterattacks. And it is a bit disappointing when Portugal is having one of the more talented generations of attackers they've had in a while. We have Andrés Silva, we have Guedes, we have Bernardo Silva. All of these seem like players who could really help you organize a good counter-attacking game. Again, I don't expect Portugal to be Spain. I expect Portugal to be a good counter-attacking team. I don't expect them to attack a lot, but much like Iran, I expect them to have a well-defined attacking transition, and they don't seem to have that unless Ronaldo is organizing it. And I think their match against Iran taught me a lot about how Fernando Santos thinks about football. For example, Iran was going to be the kind of team that was going to force Portugal to be more proactive, to have a bit more of a possession game and better ball circulation to disorder the Iranian defense. Or at least that's how a more proactive coach would think. That's not how Santos thinks. What he did actually is that he lined up his usual 4-4-2, but in the double pivot, instead of the more creative Moutinho, he actually went for Adrian Silva and paired him up with William Carvalho. In other words, two really defensive midfielders who make Portugal's ball circulation and possession unbearably slow. So that's one thing that goes out the window in terms of attack. And then in the right wing, I find it very curious that he used Ricardo Quaresma instead of the more creative Bernardo Silva. Again, Silva is the kind of player who would make your team play better as a whole in order to break down the Iranian defensive block, while Quaresma is the more individualist kind of talent. And it seems Quaresma was given the instruction to cross compulsively, I guess, because he ended the match with 10 crosses, and Portugal in general ended the match with almost 20 crosses. So what does that tell us about Santos? That he probably, when he wants to break down a tight defense, his strategy is going to be brute force crossing into the box where Ronaldo and where Andres Silva are going to be waiting. Nothing about having a good collective attacking system in general. And I think Santos also expects that some individualist talents, individual actions are going to help him break down that defense too. Like, for example, whatever Ronaldo can do, a good free kick, or what Quaresma did by shooting the ball and scoring in the way he best knows how to with his famous Trivela shot. So yes, I think that Santos's mentality about attacking systems really affects the way Portugal's attack is structured. But I also think that there's a factor regarding player form. I think when there's an attacking player in really good form, Santos is going to take notice and incorporate him into the system somehow. But in a way, it feels like Guedes and Bernardo Silva haven't fully justified that. It still seems that they've yet to find a role that really works for them. And in general, they haven't played that well or been present that much in Portugal's attack. I think Bernardo Silva had a couple promising interventions in the game against Spain, but we didn't see him too constantly. And in the case of Guedes, he's energetic, he's almost a one-man counterattack, but his precision in the final meters has been questionable, and overall I think that Ronaldo plays pretty well with Andres Silva as the center forward, who's been the more benefited guy out of the way Santos views football, because again, we're talking about a coach who usually prefers more of a crossing into the box approach, and that's good for Silva. And there's also the fact that Ronaldo tends to prefer having a more fixed center forward in the box, so that works well for him. But all in all, what I can say about Portugal's attack, just to end this, is the following. Portugal, at least from what we've seen in previous World Cups, the Euro tournaments, tends to play more attractive football in the group stages. And then in the knockout stages, we tend to see the usual flat Portugal in attack. And if what we saw in this World Cup in the group stages was the, quote, attractive Portugal, then we're definitely not getting a pretty Portugal attack for the knockout stages. So we're just going to keep seeing this, an attack without much structure unless Ronaldo is involved. And now, talking about the team that's a complete opposite to Portugal and has a very well-structured attack, it's time to talk about Spain. And now it's time to talk about Spain. And when looking at the Morocco game, what I was thinking, well, Spain already has a very good attack, one of the best attacks in the tournament, but is Spain's attack at its best? Is there anything Spain could do to improve the quality of their attack? And that's where I'd like to go delve into. Now, of course, the left side of Spain's attack is really solid. Honestly, I think it is the most dangerous attacking unit of the tournament. You have Isco and Iniesta who play really well off each other. You have Alba stretching rivals wide and creating spaces for his teammates. And then you have Diego Costa who moves out of the box and starts acting as a pivot point for Isco and Iniesta, and they keep moving the team forward and making more dangerous passing combinations right next to the box. I think those four are brilliant at attacking tight defenses. But here's the thing. What about Spain's right side? Have we talked about them throughout the tournament? Have we talked about David Silva? Have we talked about Thiago and his contributions from center midfield? Have we talked about Carvajal? Not really. Spain's right side has been a bit lacking in this tournament, and I'd like to go position by position and see what could be improved. So, David Silva has been a starter for a good while, and he was a key piece of Lopetegui's Spain. Now, in this Spain, both Isco and Silva are sort of false wingers, to put it this way. They Again, they're nominal wingers, but they don't really act as wingers once the team plays, and they act as additional midfielders who participate in the team's build-up play. Now, Silva has been more aggressive and more of a goal scorer when it comes to the national team, but at least in the last few matches in these World Cup matches, I haven't seen him with that goal-scoring sharpness and aggressiveness, to put it that way. He's still doing pretty well when it comes to helping the team create better attacks, but when it comes to finishing them, he doesn't look particularly sharp or particularly active. And that's a problem because right now Spain has a bit of an issue. Now, Diego Costa is doing a great job, not only scoring goals, but just in terms of how he plays and how he goes outside the box to act as a pivot point. Now, that also creates a problem. When Diego Costa moves out of the box, someone has to take his place inside the box. Otherwise, you have an issue of, well, somebody has to finish the chances that the team created, and it can't be Diego Costa because he's out there creating them. Silva has tried to compensate for this, but again, he hasn't looked particularly sharp in the box. So could there be an improvement that Spain could have there? Could it be that maybe they can switch Silva for someone more incisive and aggressive? The first names that come to mind are people like Asensio or Lucas Vázquez, but perhaps my favorite option would be Iago Aspas, who seems to be in a role when it comes to goal scoring, and he's been doing a great job as an impact substitute for Spain. That would be very interesting. It would take Spain a bit into like the territory of having like two forwards, which would be very interesting. Now, the only thing that worries me about this is that Lopetegui used Aspas as sort of a right winger in Spain's 4-3-3, and the one time he did that, it didn't look very well. He was participating too little, and he was a bit of a ghost in that match. So I'd be a bit worried about Aspas' performance there, but who knows? I think right now it would be an interesting time to try. Then we have the center midfield issue, in which Thiago tries to do things well, but I have no doubts about the player's talents, but I do worry from time to time about his decision making. The position of Spanish right center midfield is very, very delicate, and it requires very good interpretation of the game. The midfielder must know when to support Busquets on the ball at the back, and then when to move forward and support the team in the final third. It requires the midfielder to be outstanding on the ball, especially because he's the main person in charge of helping Busquets with the defensive transition. And as much as I like Thiago as just a technical talent, I'm not that sure about his decision making. And one midfielder who's really good in this aspect is Koke. I think Koke interprets the needs of Spain's right center midfield position better. And of course, he's an elite defensive asset who can be good to improve Spain's performance on defense, which has been a bit of a problem too. And I think, again, he interprets very well also these things when the team is in the final third. And finally, I'd like to talk about Carvajal, who unfortunately doesn't seem to be there, either in offense and defense. He doesn't seem to be in good form after the injuries, and to be honest, I considered Nacho to be a more defensive choice, but right now I think Nacho could actually give the team more in attack, and he certainly would give the team more in defense, which can be very useful if we consider once again the issues that this triangle of Ramos, De Gea, and Piqué is having at the moment. So I would be willing to try all those three options. Iago Aspas, the right winger, Koke as the center midfielder, and Nacho as the right back. I think that would be an interesting way to switch up Spain's right side and see if that can improve. And with that being said, that's it for the podcast for today. I hope you're liking the new podcast format. I hope that this more of a question kind of format can allow you to interact, can allow us to interact a bit more. And I really hope you can go and like answer these questions the way you feel. What do you feel about them? What things you agree on me or disagree with me on? And what would you do in this case? And again, put your answers in the comments. And finally, as always, follow the YouTube channel, The Football Engineer. Follow me on Twitter, where I'll be writing the match reviews. Follow whatever I write on Quora. And thank you very much for listening to another episode of the Football Engineer podcast, and talk to you later.